The Bitterest Enemy, written by Martin Hicks, narrated by John Delino Ziegler, Jr. Prologue. Another summer was moving into its final days in Virginia. The signs of it were still subtle so far, and maybe even unrecognized, at least by some, more likely the town or city dwellers, who, though a smaller proportion of the Army of Northern Virginia than that of their northern adversaries, still filled a considerable number of the places in the ranks. To the many farmers and country boys, however, who made up the greater part of the army, there was no mistaking them. While the days remained hot and many of the nights were still warm and sultry, the longer summer evenings were being gradually curtailed as the hours of darkness lengthened, and while the trees still retained their mantles of green, those shades now had a look of faded tiredness about them, hinting that their days were numbered as they proceeded on their steady annual decline towards yellow and brown. Harvesting, a further hallmark of this season of the year, was another, though more pessimistic matter. For a while, around the rolling hills and fields of Culpeper, Madison, and Orange counties, such cultivation as was still being undertaken had now reached ripeness. The occasion was but a pale shadow of its previous scale. A dismaying number of the Virginia Piedmont's fields were now overgrown and neglected, and many of its properties had fallen vacant, after yet another growing season that had been hamstrung and handicapped by the war. For the farmers who still labored on their land, to have reached the point of harvesting another crop was a feat of some distinction, considering that the stragglers, not to mention the patrols and commissaries of both armies, had once more become regular visitors. For the armies had returned, after their 6 weeks' absence, through the hot days of later June and most of an unusually wet July. They were back now in that region of Virginia between the Rapidan and Upper Rappahannock rivers, to continue their familiar routine of probing and shifting, of which the area had grown profoundly tired over the previous year. For the return of those endless hordes of soldiers, all of whom seemed to be constantly on the take, meant the prompt resumption of the dismal process of impoverishment, dispossession, and destruction, with the life of any farmer whose barns and paddocks were within their reach, returning to a grim battle for any sort of survival. That familiar ritual of maneuvering now had a feeling of labored tedium about it, for it was an all too familiar pattern of events, to both the civilians and the soldiers of the area, since recrossing the Potomac River in the middle of July, in the wake of their 3-day confrontation up north in Pennsylvania, the armies had, after an initial few days of pretty urgent marching, taken to sparring their way slowly southwards, skirmishing repeatedly, though without extending this to a further clash on anything like the scale of the battle that had taken place up at Gettysburg. There had been no larger fight since their return, but neither so far had there been any real break in contact which would allow the men a real period of recovery from the great battle and subsequent retreat to Virginia. Now, as a result of all of the maneuvering, they were back almost to where they had been in the earliest days of summer. They had returned to a region where supplies were short, and this threw both armies into an increased reliance upon the railroads to supply the bulk of what they needed to sustain their soldiers and animals, particularly since the campaigning was still in progress. As for the farms, many of them that had been foraged too much for supplies by the men of either army over the previous year were now vacant. Their houses stood derelict, abandoned by their families, and their fields lay overgrown and weed-strewn. They were a visible testimony to the Piedmont's suffering and its weariness with this war, now almost at the midpoint of its 3rd year. Worse still was the fact that there was, as yet, no tangible sign of it ending, of the victory that had been so taken for granted by both sides when the conflict has flared into life. While there had been little in the way of rest and recuperation for the troops, the after-the-event analysis in the Confederate Army of Northern Virginia on their foray into Yankee territory had already been extensive, and it still continued. The Army had begun its movement early in June in the wake of its victory at Chancellorsville a month previously. 3 weeks had been spent sidling to the west and north initially along the upper reaches of the Rappahannock River, which had been the front line since the end of the previous autumn, into this very area to which they now had returned. The Army had then moved north, most of it by way of the lower Shenandoah Valley, before
Sample complete. Ready to continue?